We are here with the Audrius Plioplys, indeed. He is a Canadian, first generation born of Lithuanian immigrants, refugees from the Soviet Union. Um, he went on to become a renowned neurologist and a professional artist. In 2011, he organized the Hope and Spirit exhibition, in which he talked about the experiences of Lithuanians who were deported and sent to Soviet concentration camps. So, Audrey, you mentioned in the letters from Siberia, which I already translated. I will link the video in the description. That some of your family members suffered the repression from the communist government. Isn't that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Do you know what your family members did for a living, especially your grandmother, and what they did for a living? Were they really cool as rich bourgeoisie?
I just wanted to explain the project that I did, Hope and Spirit. That was exactly 10 years ago that I launched it, and it was in the middle of June, like it is now approaching middle of June. And on June 13th, now 80 years ago, is the day that the deportations all started in Lithuania and in Latvia and Estonia, in the Baltic republics. So 10 years ago, it was the 70-year anniversary of the start of all of the stalinistic terror that started taking place in June of 1941. And now it's 80 years, and the anniversary is coming up in just, 10 days or so, the start of it. So it's a very appropriate time for us to be talking about this event, right? Which happened exactly 80 years ago. Now, among my own blood relatives, 4 of my blood relatives, including both of my grandfathers, died during or as a consequence of NKVD interrogations. Now, for all of these individuals, their crime and why they were interrogated was because they had small family farms. They were farmers, and they had land. And nobody in Lithuania then, these are not American-style giant enterprises, and most of everything there was very little in the way of tractors, for example. Everything was horse-drawn equipment at that time. So that to consider people to be extremely wealthy was absurd. They just happened to own land, and other people didn't, and that was their basic crime. Now, my own blood relatives, 12 were deported to Siberia. The vast majority of them also because they were landowners. They had something, and that was the cause for most of the people's deportation. You owned land, you owned a violin, you owned a piano, you had an education. Teachers, lawyers, doctors, because they were educated. They owned something of value. Get rid of them. They're potential trouble for the future society. We have to get rid of them. So that the reason for deportations was really minimal at that time. Anyone who was perceived as possible threat, just get rid of them. They're very easy to kill them or deport them. Now, the only blood relative that I've had personal experience with was my grandmother. She was a farm woman, working on the farm her entire life. She was really not literate. She didn't know how to read and write without an education. She was 71 years old when she was deported to Siberia. And in her particular case, she was accused of providing food to partisans. These were people fighting against the Red Army that she was supporting. She was not actually doing that, but neighbors were upset at her and wanted to teach her a lesson, and so they did. And there was no evidence at all. All it was is that they accused her of it, and that's all it took. She was sentenced to 12 years in Siberia, ended up serving 8 years because then Stalin eventually died and people were allowed to return. And she came back. And when she was back in Lithuania, my father and my uncle, every single year, filled out papers to have her come either to Canada, where I was living, or my uncle in the United States to leave and come to better circumstances. And that was constantly denied. She can't leave until her health started to deteriorate. Now, she was 71 years of age when she was deported. She was 79 when she came back to Lithuania, and she was still working full time on the farms. You know, these are now collective farms, and she was working there for quite a few years into her 80s until she wasn't able to do it anymore. Physically wasn't able to do it, and she was going blind from cataracts. And so since she was no longer useful, they allowed her to leave. So that's how I met her. And for a few years, she lived in the United States, and then she passed away. Now, when I met her, I spoke with her about her experiences there. And she was now a 71-year-old woman, sent to a lumber camp to chop trees. And so she had no experience with axes or chopping trees or doing anything like that at all, but that was her assigned job. And so she did the best that she could. And on my website, the Hope and Spirit website, there's a photo of her sitting next to a tree that she helped to chop down. But very early on in her stay there, she not knowing how to use axes, she accidentally chopped herself in her leg. Now, normally that would be a lethal accident, you know, because you still have to go work, you have to do things, and you know, with no real healthcare being provided. But what happened is there were a large number of families there with smaller kids, and winter was starting to come along, and so she was reassigned to a different job to kind of take care and to educate children. And so the children were provided a warmth environment, you know, where a place to stay where there was heat and warmth and food. And she prepared the food for them and educated them, took care of them. And so she was able to survive those 8 years that she was there because of that particular circumstance. So out of a tragedy that would normally have been, you know, killed you, it turned out to be life-saving for her. What she told me is that during particularly the winters in Siberia were particularly difficult, and during each year during the winters, about 1/3 of the people living there died from starvation, cold exposure, overwork. The permafrost ground in the winter times you couldn't chop into it with solid ice. So the bodies were simply stacked up like logs in one place, waiting for the spring thaw. And then when the permafrost thawed, then the bodies were buried each year. But each year was about 30%, and more people were, you know, every year deported to that kind of prison camp area. So that was her experience. And then when she came back, of course, Lithuania, she had to work on the farm. She was with her husband. They were had to have been owners of the farm, but when she came back, it was now a collective farm. And she just although she lived in the same house, she just had a small room there and worked on the fields and helped out. So that's the only person that I had experience with. My mother's cousin wrote down her experience, and I think you read it. It's translated in English. I never met her myself or had any contact directly, so that all there is that document which you've seen and read, and I don't have nothing else to add to that at all.
The cousin of your mother, he was also accused of being a gulag, yeah, and was deported to Siberia as well. He spent, she said there, 8 years in Siberia, 4 of which was spent in a farm, in a collective farm. He mentioned that her husband had pneumonia, and her son, her little son, who was with him, had a kidney inflammation. And there's a passage she stated that, and I quote, "I have washed all the paths in Siberia for my tears." So it's it's tough to read the account, you know. But you mentioned the husband of her mother, who was, I believe, also arrested. Uh, what what happened to him?
I have no information other than what's there. Nothing.
Okay.
I've never met these people, and then by the time I was starting to do my family history and everything, everyone had passed away. So that this is just we have a correspondence that that she wrote everything down and sent it to my mother, and my mother kept it, and so that's how we have access to that information. But there's nothing else additional that I can add at all. There's no information. All the people there have passed away, so there's no access that I ever had.
And when did you become interested in this? Was it any kind of a topic in your family? People talked about it.
It was a constant thing when I was growing up in Toronto, Canada. My parents fled. Both my father and mother fled from Lithuania, knowing that if they stayed, that they would be killed. To stay there would be death. They knew that, and so they fled. But they just not that they wanted to leave their home country. They fully expected to come back to Lithuania. And so they were married in Toronto, Canada, where I was born and raised in Toronto, Canada. And their expectation was that the United States Army, the Allied Army, is not going to allow the Red Army to keep all of Eastern Europe, that this will be liberated again, that they'll be able to go home. So that when I was growing up, I was not taught English language at all. Just Lithuanian with my sister, only Lithuanian. And so that when first grade started, I had to go to school for first grade. I remember that day very well. My mother took me there, left me there, and I didn't know a single word of English. And so I was yelling and screaming and crying all day long. That's a very memorable day in my life. But then I eventually learned English. My parents bought a television set, which old time black and white television set, and I learned English from watching children's shows. A particular show called Howdy Doody, a puppet, which was a popular TV show. So that's why my English is not very good. It's very childish still. That's where I learned English from. So, and then the entire growing up experience in Toronto, Canada, was still the idea that eventually we'll be moving back. The whole family will be. And the things that happened in Lithuania as we became known about the killings and the deportations and the suffering that people had was everyday knowledge. Every day, when we went to Sundays to church, it was mentioned all the time at any kind of Lithuanian historical events taking place or festivals. It was always mentioned. My parents, people who were sent to Siberia, were able to survive only because of packages that their relatives sent. So my parents, my uncles, they all sent packages regularly to support my grandmother and other people in Lithuania and in Siberia, so that they have clothes and food. So a good portion of our income went to support these people. So this was part of my entire life growing up. And since it was such a significant part of my life, and I knew it extremely well, and the suffering people had, you'd think that the general community would sort of know about it too. But as I became an adult, and then both in Canada and in the United States, it really stunned me how few people knew about Stalin and what he had done. The knowledge of Hitler was, everyone knew that, how terrible that was. But Stalin, who did more killing than Hitler did, considerably, maybe several times, what Hitler had done, is not known, just forgotten about. So that when I had an opportunity, this was now 10 years ago, I had to leave medical practice and my work because of health issues, and it was no longer possible to work. But then when my health started to come back and starting to do better. And with the 70-year anniversary of the deportations, I thought this is a good opportunity to bring this entire experience, not just Lithuania, but the Baltic republics, all of Eastern Europe, to the attention of the American public and do something about it. So it was a program that really ran for 1 year at the Balzakas Museum of Lithuanian Culture in Chicago. But then about 6 months beforehand, preparing it, and 6 months afterwards, documenting everything, pulling all the videos together and imaging all the documents we found. And it was it took up 2 years of my life, and it was the most successful exhibit in the museum's history in terms of public relations, in terms of press coverage, in terms of media coverage that the museum's ever had, and even including the past 10 years. So it was successful in terms of getting the word out, and that I had wanted to do. So in that regard, it was good, and it did work. So I'm really proud. So that's how this all happened, and how it evolved.
And do you know anyone in Canada who has the same kind of background as you? I mean, who suffered deportation and fled the Soviet Union?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question.
Do you know anyone whose family also fled the Soviet Union? Because I know that Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote the Golden Archipelago, also went to Canada. So do you know anyone else?
Oh, there's a very, very large community of people, very, very large number of Lithuanians left after World War II. The city that the largest population moved to was Chicago. And after that, the second largest would be Toronto. So there was a very, very large number of families and people that moved, like my parents, my uncles. So that, and then across the United States and other cities, smaller numbers. But it was really a very, very large number of people escaped. About 1/3 of the population of Lithuania escaped. The general way is about 1/3 left and went to the west, 1/3 stayed, and 1/3 were deported or killed to Siberia. So that's kind of the general picture of what happened in Lithuania. So it was the total number of people left probably was like 1 million. But I'm not a historian in those kind of details. But it was a very, very large Lithuanian community in Toronto where I grew up, in the same situation. You know, their parents were from Lithuania, and we were born and raised in Canada.
And you mentioned in the videos that you made, the story of the Plioplys, you mentioned that your father eventually went up to Germany before emigrating to the United States. He fought the Russians in Lithuania before going to the United States. I find that interesting because the Russians at that point they were the allied, and they fought Hitler. And Solzhenitsyn also states in the archipelago that a great many number of Russians joined the Nazis to fight the Russians. So the reign of terror that Stalin imposed was so great that they were willing to delay the defeat of Hitler to try to get their countries free again. So I found that interesting that you mentioned. Did your father ever talk with you about his experience in fighting the Russians?
No, the thing about it was that I was involved in school, educating, medical school, doing everything. And so very preoccupied with life's activities. And besides medical school, doing my artwork. And the only time that it became possible for me to devote, which I wanted to, I planned to talk to my father, get information, pull the family history together after I finished my internship, but a year before that he passed away. So I never had a chance to talk to him directly about his life events. So it was after his death, and actually his death motivated me to collect my family history, to document it. And all that material has been pulled together and done. And the vast majority of people whose reminiscences are included in my family history books of family history, are all passed away. So that if you try to do it now, there doesn't exist. It's all gone, except for what I did over the past 45 years, collecting it. Now, my father, so the information that I have was obtained from other relatives. So it's not direct. It may not be totally accurate. But during the war, my father worked for Lithuanian police as a border guard. The Plioplys village was not far from the Prussian border, now the Kaliningrad border, and he worked as a border policeman, border guard. Then when the Red Army was coming back for the second time, and he had to flee, like most Lithuanians ended up in Germany. Other people, my one uncle ended up in Czechoslovakia, but when they fled, most ended up in Germany. But when he was in Germany, it was still, the war was going. It had not ended yet. And the way the story understanding is, he volunteered to help to work with the German army at anti-aircraft battery to shoot down Russian planes. So he was a sort of volunteer. Well, he wasn't a member of the Nazi party. He was not a member of the German army. He just helped to do that, to shoot down the planes. So of course now you end up with a kind of a peculiar situation, because the planes were headed to destroy Hitler, which is a good thing to do, but at the same so that you have to shoot them down, you think is bad. But when you look at the historical aftermaths of what happened, that all of Eastern Europe was under Stalinist oppression, the millions of people that he'd then subsequently killed. I think it's a very honorable thing that my father did. That's something that I'm proud of. On top of that, you have to realize the historical detail of who started the war. Who started World War II? It wasn't Hitler. It was Hitler and Stalin together. They had the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, which they signed months before the actual battle started. And so it was Russia started World War, equal to Hitler. So that to shoot down Russian planes, I think, was a very, very honorable thing. Anyway, that's my opinion. I'm proud of what my father did.
And do you think that it's appropriate to compare the concentration camps of Hitler and Stalin? Do you think that it's appropriate to compare them?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Historically, my understanding is this: is that when Hitler was planning to start building concentration camps, he had a delegation of SS people go to Russia and visit Stalin's death camps and see what Stalin was doing in the death camps where he was set up. Now, Germans with German ingenuity came back with that information and then improved on it massively, made it much better, so that the German death camps originated from the Stalin's death camps, but they were made much more efficient, much more German ingenuity, German engineering at work. And so that's it. So that I think it's totally correct to compare them. And the way things happened because of the German ingenuity, the mass murder that took place never took place in a similar fashion. It was different. Russia did not have gas chambers like the Germans did. So that was an additional technological advancement that the Nazis came up with. So they're not totally the same, but I think that they're comparable enough, and where the one came out of the other.
And if you read the accounts of the people who survived, you'll see that the experiences are very similar. And one thing that I found interesting in reading the accounts of people who survived, they say that was the concentration camps, all the death and deportation, was only Stalin that fault. It was only due to Stalin, and we now know that the camps and all of it started with Lenin, by order of Lenin. And do you think that his death and all of it is a inherent part of the communist ideology, or it is just one thing that occurred with Lenin or Stalin?
Well, I think historically speaking, deportations are much older history. It goes into Tsarist Russia. There are waves of deportations from the early 1800s taking place. I know from Lithuania because of revolutions that took place against Tsarist Russia. Apprehend people and deport them to Siberia was sort of a long-standing tradition. So Lenin did not invent it. There was something that was there. Now, in terms of details about what camps and prisons out in Siberia and how they were handled, that may have been different from the Tsarist days to Lenin and Stalin, very much so. But the concept of deportation is a long-standing Russian tradition.
And what would you say to people in Brazil, especially from the communist part of Brazil, who refuse to acknowledge Stalin's crime?
Well, you know, it's what can I say? It's ignoring a gigantic portion of history, selectively ignoring it, which is idiotic. It's idiotic. It's stupid, idiotic. And if you claim it never happened, then you're lying. You're just blatant lying. So that's the only thing I can say about it. It makes no sense. I can imagine that a person could still be kind of understand their own worldview of communism and be a good person and have an idea that the Communist Party could do good things for society. But you have to acknowledge the bad things that did occur, and you have to make sure that nothing like that ever happened again. So I can imagine that would be the case. But as you pointed out, ignoring everything is the way people tend to do. And certainly my little experience in the United States with what I've known about the Communist Party here too is the same thing. They just ignore what happened as if it never happened, and that to me is incomprehensible. It's total stupidity and incomprehensible.
And I believe now we are heading to the end. I just want to talk a little bit about yourself. You went to University of Chicago to study atomic physics, and you went out to study medicine. Never have you ever thought of majoring in history or anything like that?
Well, no, just history is just I grew up in the world of history, so that no, I didn't do any specific historical studies in my education. No.
And why did you turn to medicine?
Oh, this is interesting because I went to the University of Chicago. It was and still is one of the top atomic physics education centers in the world. And I went there to try and understand what matter is, what makes up atoms, what makes up all the subatomic particles. Now that time, which was a long time ago, quarks had just been hypothesized. So, and new particles were being discovered every week almost. So it was a very exciting time in atomic physics then. And so I thought, going to one of the best institutions, that's ideal. It's wonderful to do that. Now, everything was going well until I started my second year of college. And then this requirement showed up. The requirement was that I have to do a year of biology. And I couldn't understand, why do I have to do biology? It was got nothing to do with physics, mathematics. I have no interest in frogs or lizards or anything like that. So I went to my advisor, and he was the chairman of the Department of Chemistry. I pleaded with, please, don't let me do that. I'll study Greek. I'll do Aristotle, Plato, anything, just not this. And he says, well, okay, the problem is this: I can let you do it, but the problem is after 4 years you will not get a degree. You'll graduate, but no degree, because you have to do the biology. Okay, so I said, oh, okay. I went there, very sad, unhappy, wasting my time. The person, the teacher, Richard Mentel, who was the teacher of this course, was recently graduated, recently finished college. He was incredibly interesting, incredibly dynamic person. Sometimes he'd even stand up on the table and as he's so excited about what he's talking about. But when he got to the brain and how the mind works, it just blew me away. Absolutely blew me away. How is it that this organ in our head, 100 billion neurons, which is smaller than our liver, smaller than the number of cells in our liver, produces thinking? How does it produce consciousness? Produces us as human beings, produces society. How does that happen? Then I started thinking, that question is much more interesting than what this table in front of me is made out of. And so when I realized that's when I shifted into neurology and into medicine. It was specifically to do neurology, not general medicine, that I did that. So that's how that particular thing happens. It's the influence of a teacher, a specific teacher.
And when did you start your artistic career?
My which career?
Your artistic career.
Oh, that was during medical school. When I was growing up in Toronto, my best friend, who was about 2 years older than me, he was a very delinquent fellow. And for example, he was 13 years old and he already had a motorcycle. And I don't know where he got the money for it and how he did it, but it was fun sitting on the motorcycle. He driving me around Toronto then, a little kid. But one summer, the parents tried to keep him out of trouble and put him into art school. And so I would come and I would watch him at his house, take a canvas, a white piece of canvas, and then lines would show up, dark charcoal lines, and then colored. And eventually, you have a painting, a beautiful landscape. So he took nothing and made something beautiful out of nothing. I couldn't believe it. That just blew me. Well, that was the seed for art. It grew slowly throughout my entire life. And it started really blossoming when I was in medical school. So I started painting more and more and more. And by the time I finished medical school, I was in a quandary. I said, well, maybe I made a mistake. I should have gone into art. So I finished my internship, and then I dropped out entirely of medicine, out of neurology, went to the East Coast of the United States and did art full-time for 3 years. And so, and I've continued to do art ever since. I eventually went back to do neurology, and I've combined both neurology, neuroscience research, and my art all at the same time.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, you have this series, the artistic exploration of thought, and you have those colorful patterns. What are those patterns?
I'm sorry, what are those what?
The colorful patterns in your artistic exploration of thought, the series. How are they done?
I like color very much. It sort of stimulates and makes things very interesting and lively. And to me, visual art has to be engaging visually. It has to attract viewers. I put a lot of content in my work, a lot of layers. For example, my pieces include my own electroencephalograms, my brainwaves, my brain scans, previous transformed artwork. And there's a lot of reasons why I included different layers. So there's a lot of content in there. So actually it's conceptual. I consider this to be conceptual art. But I also want it to be visually appealing, visually interesting. And that's where color comes in. And color makes it alive. Color makes it a living, more of a living thing. And that's how. So most of my most recent work is I've done many over the years, decades, many different techniques: oil painting, drawings, watercolors, photography, all kinds of indoor-outdoor installations, light sculptures, LED light sculptures in the last couple of years, which have been very popular and very successful. So that with environmental kind of effects. And then a lot of my recent work is all digital things. And then I print them on paper or print them on large scale on canvas. And a lot of the pieces are very big. We're talking like pieces that are 3.5 meters by 7 meters in size, which are very, very large pieces. So and incorporate many different elements. So that the visual part of it is, I think, as a piece of visual, it's very important. And sort of colors play an important role in these works. And they also include neuronal patterns and thinking and consciousness. That's the underlying theme of all my work.
And have you ever made or thought of making an exhibit on Latin America or in Brazil?
I've never been to Brazil, ever. I've never been. Well, the farthest south I've gone to is Cancun in Mexico. so I've never been there. I should visit at some point. Absolutely, it's important. You are correct. Latin America is an important part of the world.
And do you plan on make other inquiries about Stalin in the future, or the project is done?
Well, my artwork after the entire installation and the Hope and Spirit project was 10 years ago. It was very successful. I'm not going to be repeating that particular thing. I took elements out of that and created a series of light sculptures called Siberia Souls, which were very popular. And there were lots of exhibits of the light sculptures in different locations. They were the exhibit of the week in Chicago by the Chicago Tribune. That's the main newspaper in the Chicago area. When they were exhibited in a very large exhibit in Grand Rapids, Michigan, in 1 month, there were about 17,000 people saw it. So they did attract a lot of attention. And so I was getting so my artwork did incorporate that entire series. Those are the light sculptures. And then I also created prints on paper, Siberia Souls, and I've exhibited them, and a series of it is up on exhibit right now at the Baltakis Museum of Plain Culture in Chicago. If it wasn't for the pandemic, last June, I was supposed to have an exhibit in New York City in the Chelsea area of the Siberia Souls, but the pandemic ended. It maybe next June I'll have that exhibit take place. And then that same series, Siberia Souls, will be displayed in Lithuania in September, an exhibit that's going to be there at the museum. I'll be out there at that time. So that the issue of Siberian deportations hasn't stopped, and it's incorporated in my artwork now, and in art exhibits that are up, that have been up, are up, and will be up, and I'll continue showing them as long as there's interest in people wanting to see these pieces.
Oh, I believe we are done. Is there something that you would like to say to the Brazilians who will watch it?
Well, I want to thank you, Paulo, for all your efforts and energy and work about this entire subject. You know, it seems to me that we had one thing in common. We both know about the history of Stalin and what he did, and and appreciate the horror of it, and understand the horror, but that the general community doesn't know it, and in some cases actually wants to deny it, which is incomprehensible. And you're doing something about it. You're trying. I tried to do what I could about it, and you're doing it. So I want to compliment you and commend you for all the efforts that you're doing. And I think a round of applause for Paulo.
Thank you, sir. For me, it was an honor to be able to make it. You know, I want to thank you for first for letting me do this, and for doing this amazing work that you did the exhibit. It was not just for you or for the Lithuanians. It was something for the whole humanity. You know. So thank you for letting me do this, and to all the effort that you did to help me with that. So who knows, maybe by next year we can meet in Chicago. I don't know, I plan to go to the University of Chicago. Maybe we can meet.
Oh, wonderful. Be glad to see you. Wow. I'm on campus a lot. I'm over there a lot. It's taking place.